I live in a house with Christ. I could not have fancied the extreme, ineffable comfort of being in the same house with him who cured the sick and taught his disciples, as we read of him in the Gospels, in the days of his flesh.
This is the building where Newman lived for 4 years before, during that stage in his spiritual journey before he was received into the Catholic Church. I've just come out of the chapel where he was received by Blessed Dominic Barbary in 1845. This is his bedroom where he lived and went through that difficult discerning process. He had released Tract 90 of the Oxford Movement's statements about renewal of the Anglican Church, and had caused such a controversy.
This is Littlemore, Newman's small parish outside Oxford. We're about 3 miles from the city centre here, and Newman found that when he was made vicar of St Mary's Church in Oxford, he was responsible for this parish as well. A small area, very quiet in those days. There was no church, no school, and a lot of people who needed attention.
John Henry Newman was a man with a courageous heart. An Anglican preacher, he lived in England a century ago. He was the vicar of the elite college of Oxford, and the vicar had a question. How did the Christians of the first centuries see the church? He researched and slowly unearthed a few truths that would change his life and the life of many an Englishman.
So Newman came out here to investigate. What did people need? The first thing they needed was education. And so he founded a school. And the school is still here next door to us. You may even be able to hear the children crying in the playground. And then he knew they needed a church, because you couldn't expect people to walk an hour every day to church. Well, not that they went every day, every Sunday to church. And it's an hour's walk down to Newman's Church in Oxford. And so he and his friends got together the money, and they got an architect, and they designed this little chapel, the Chapel of St Nicholas and Our Blessed Lady of Littlemore. This was in about 1839, 1840. Newman's mother lived in the village at the time with his sisters, and she died, and she was buried down in Oxford in Newman's Church there. But her memorial is in this church, and she never lived to see it finished, but she laid the foundation stone. And this was the beginning of Newman's real involvement with Littlemore.
John Henry Newman started to write essays that he made public. They were called tracts. Friends on horse would distribute them from parsonage to parsonage in a matter of a few days. In his first tracts, Newman encouraged his clergy brothers to return to their flock. More than half of them resided outside their parishes in better neighbourhoods. Newman wished to see them return to the people and forget about their higher rank in society.
I am but one of yourselves, a presbyter. Speak I must. For the times are evil, yet none speaks against them. Should the government or the country so far forget their God as to cast off the church, to deprive it of its temporal honours and substance, on what will you rest the claim of respect and attention which you make upon your flocks? You have been upheld by your birth and education, your wealth and your connections. Should these secular advantages cease, on what then must Christ's ministers depend?
Down in the city you had the university, you had the prestige, you had the crowds, but up here we had ordinary people, farming people, country people, ordinary people with souls. And all through his life, Newman was more concerned for ordinary people with souls than for the rich and the powerful. We always think of Newman as an intellectual, but he was much more at home teaching the catechism to the little children of Littlemore. Although in his letters he writes and says, I really don't know the first way to begin. Some of the children here don't know the difference between Adam and Noah. And anyway, the first thing to do is to get them clean and to buy them clean dresses. And that's what he wrote to his friends, and he got his sisters to help. And between Newman and his family, his sisters, his mother's legacy, and his friends, he set up a thriving little community here, a school and a church. And he came to love Littlemore much more than he loved his parish in Oxford. At first he would come up just for Lent, spend a few days staying with one of his parishioners. There was one who used to keep a pub down the road, the Queen's Head. And then he began to think of the idea of making a little community in Littlemore. What sort of a community? He wasn't quite sure to begin with. And there were lots of jokes between his friends about what it was going to be and where it was going to be. And he started buying land. There's a bit more land behind here where he planted trees. And then eventually some property came up for sale and he decided to buy it. And that property is not far away. I'm going to walk down there now. It'll take about 3 minutes and I'll see you there.
This unsightly building is divided by a number of walls, so as to form so many little cells, and it is so low that you might almost touch the roof with your hand. In the interior, you will find the most beautiful specimen of patriarchal simplicity and gospel poverty.
And here we are in Newman's College, as they sometimes call it, in Littlemore. We've only come about 200 yards from the church. It's a little row of buildings, used to be a granary, and one of Newman's friends and parishioners had begun converting the granary into a row of cottages. The whole of the row along there were the cottages, the former granary. And at the end of the row, there was a stable. And Newman looked at it and thought, I'll buy this. And he bought the granary, and he built that shed, as he called it, connecting the cottages up. And he got them to convert the stable into a library. And this was to be a home for him where he could study and pray and write, and where some of his young friends could come to study and pray and write. But while we're still in the garden, we'll show you the bust of Newman. It was made by Catholic sculptress Rosamond Fletcher. It shows him as he was at this time. Still a young man, not quite 40 when he came here, and dressed in the style of the period, of course. No clerical collars in those days, but the sort of the cravat and the smart suit. But by this time always black. When he was younger, they used to wear bright colours, but this is the beginning of the Victorian age, when people began to dress in black.
This is the building where Newman lived for 4 years during that stage in his spiritual journey before he was received into the Catholic Church. I've just come out of the chapel where he was received by Blessed Dominic Barbary in 1845. This is his bedroom where he lived.
And so when the Bishop of Oxford, the Anglican bishop, wrote to Newman to say, what on earth are you doing setting up a monastery in Littlemore? Newman was able to write back and say, oh no, it's not a monastery, it's just somewhere to live, a parsonage house. It isn't a monastery, there's no chapter house, there's no refectory, there's no chapel, and if you want to call that shed a cloister, you can, but it's really just a place to live, a mone in the classical sense. But when he wrote to Pusey, and when he wrote to Maria Gibbon and the others, he played on the fact that the word had come to mean, in later Greek, a monastery. And they did joke about it being a monastery. It's a place where we're going to live together in the religious life. Yet when Newman first came here, he was working on an edition of the works of St. Athanasius, his favourite saint. And it's in those works of St. Athanasius you will find the other meanings of the word mone. In a footnote written here in this very room, at this desk, Newman comments that a mone, or mansio, probably means the building where soldiers or other public officers rested at night, hence its application to monastic houses. And he's talking about mones, or monai in the plural, on the itinerary of Antoninus and the route that St. Athanasius and people followed, and every night you stayed the night in a mone or mansio. And his note goes on, it concludes, such buildings included granaries, stabling, etc. And that line is one of Newman's little in-jokes. He was writing here in a building that had been a granary and a stable. It was once, in fact, a place where horses were rested before taking the stagecoach journey into London.
Why then have these men confined themselves to such a place? Why? Because they considered that the gospel was better than worldly wisdom, because they looked upon the salvation of their souls as something far above the possession of rich livings, and heaven much superior to earth.
Because we're standing now in the library of Newman's College. This is the room that was originally a stable, and it was converted into a library. And Newman had a tremendous collection of great volumes of the Church Fathers here, the books which are now in the library in Birmingham. And more recently, it's now become the library of the Newman Centre here in Littlemore. So there's a huge collection of Newman's own books and books about Newman and books of the background to Newman. And it's from these, from Newman's own writings, that we can work out something of what he thought he was doing when he came here.
In 1845, after many years of research into the Christianity of the 5th century, Newman made a remarkable discovery.
My stronghold was antiquity. Now here, in the middle of the 5th century, I found reflected, as it seemed to me, the Christendom of the 16th and 19th centuries.
Eventually, in Tract 90, Newman expressed openly his historical findings concerning more recent times. After study, he had concluded that the 39 articles defining the Church of England were not contrary to Roman Catholic doctrine. Yes, they were aimed at corrupt Roman practices, but not at the core of the Catholic faith. They could then be read with a Catholic heart.
On the whole, all parties will agree that of all existing systems, the present communion of Rome is the nearest approximation, in fact, to the Church of the Fathers. Possible, though some may think it, to be nearer still to that church on paper. Did St. Athanasius or St. Ambrose come suddenly to life, it cannot be doubted what communion he would take to be his own.
This was Newman's writing desk. This is the desk he used to write his innumerable letters, and more importantly, the works of scholarship that he composed in this house, his historical works and his great work on the development of Christian doctrine. And so when Blessed Dominic Barbary came here to receive Newman into the church, and they needed a suitable table to use as an altar, this is what they used. Because it does let down. If you remove the brace at the back, it goes down flat. But quite rightly, it's never kept flat, otherwise people will put coffee cups on it, which would spoil the effect. So except when it's used for Mass, which it is occasionally, when we have large groups coming here for Mass, we can't fit into the chapel, and we do say Mass in this room on this desk, or I have said Mass on it more than once. And it is, therefore, a relic in its own right. And luckily it was able to be brought back through the kindness of the Wilberforce family several years ago. So it is an authentic piece of furniture. This isn't just a desk of the period, it is the actual desk on which Mass was celebrated by Blessed Dominic when John Henry Newman received his first Holy Communion.
In 1843, Newman wrote to a friend that he definitely believed the Roman Catholic Church was the true church founded by the Apostles. To him, the Church of England was in schism, and if obviously there were graces in it, those graces were extraordinary and from the overflowing of the divine dispensation. The authorities rose up in a rage. The heads of the colleges at Oxford declared Tract 90 incompatible with the university statutes. Newman's career was ended, and the Anglican bishops of Oxford banned all future tracts.
He knew that he had to face the reality of what his studies and reflections were meaning in his life. It's one of those, what we call no man's land in the spiritual journey of so many converts, where they, because of what they've learned and studied and prayed, know that they can no longer stay Protestant. They can't go back, but they're not yet sure where they're going.
Newman preached his last sermon at Littlemore. He said how he had found the church of his birth and of his early affections wanting. He was torn between the sadness of those he was leaving and the enthusiasm of those demanding that he follow the truth he had found. John Newman would no more speak to his friends from that pulpit. He committed them to God and recommended them to do their best. Tradition says that there were tears in his eyes.
In this glass case are some artifacts of Blessed Dominic Barbary, who received Newman into the church. And behind us on this wall over here is a letter penned by Cardinal Newman to his sister on the night before he was received. And you have to understand, it was a very touchy issue for these Anglicans telling their family and friends about this decision they were about to make. And very difficult. And I can't read his writing, but it was read to me earlier, and it was a very touching statement, knowing that his sister would find this such a difficult decision.
With what conscience could I have remained? How could I have answered it on the last day? If having opportunities of knowing the truth which others have not, I had not availed myself of them.
But he was saying that in the morning he would meet Father Barbary in that chapel. And in fact, at this point, Father Dominic Barbary didn't even know that Newman would be received the next morning, but Newman says that he will be requesting a Father Barbary reception into the church. And it's in that next room.
After this, Newman definitively retired to Littlemore. A group of followers joined him to lead a quasi-monastic life.
Here I am sitting at Newman's desk, using maybe Newman's ink pen, looking at Newman's letters and Newman's spectacles, or at least they're spectacles of the period. This room is certainly the room that Newman lived in, and it was refurnished about 40, 50 years ago, as far as possible with the furniture of the period. So though each individual item may not have been used by Newman, it would have been very familiar to him. It's the sort of desk, it's the sort of chair, it's the sort of bed. Very simple, very rough. The floor is brick and there is no carpet. There's a little stove, a little open fire. When Blessed Dominic Barbary came here, he commented on how austere they were. He said there are very few Franciscans or Capuchins in Italy who would tolerate living in conditions like this. The bare floors, cold in the winter, and the very simple furniture, and no real comforts.
Now, in this house, I may say barn, the best geniuses of the Anglican Church have retired and lived together for about 6 years. Persons of birth, learning, and piety, who possessed, or at least might have possessed, the richest livings and fellowships which the Church of England can bestow on her followers.
If you ask me what you are to do in order to be perfect, I say, first, do not lie in bed beyond the time of rising. Give your first thoughts to God. Make a good visit to the Blessed Sacrament. Say the Angelus devoutly. Eat and drink to God's glory. Say the rosary well. Be recollected. Keep out bad thoughts. Make your evening meditation well. Examine yourself daily. Go to bed in good time, and you are already perfect.
There were 2 meals a day, breakfast, consisting of bread and butter and tea, taken standing up, and dinner. In Lent, no meat was eaten. The rule of the community prescribed silence for half the day. Reading, writing, and praying were the occupations of the morning. Later, Newman would often take his brothers for a walk.
The man that is not stirred up by these examples is inexorable in his blindness. O man, O Englishman, hear the voice of Littlemore. Dominic of the Mother of God, Passionist.
Communities of priests didn't break up under their own weight. There was nothing wrong with the communities. It's always a war or a revolution or a tyrannical or an oppressive government that destroys them. Just as here in England, several hundred colleges and communities of secular priests were destroyed by what I think of now as the Taliban of the English Reformation in the time of King Edward VI, when they were just swept away. All these communities were abolished without any compensation, without any substitute. You can't guard against that. Every generation sometimes has to rebuild. The community which they founded here was not, strictly speaking, a monastery. They never thought of taking vows. They never thought of giving up their own property. It was more like a college, or indeed an oratory. And it's not surprising that the next stage after this stage in Newman's life was to be the oratory, a community of priests living together in common, but without vows, and still owning our own property, especially books. I have the extraordinary grace to be a member of an oratory community here in Oxford, very much in the tradition of Newman, but going back behind Newman to the teaching of St. Philip Neri, who is our great founder. A community of priests living together, not, I'm afraid, quite as austerely as Newman and his friends did in this house, but very much in the same spirit, with the potentiality for study, for pastoral work, and for prayer in common, doing our bit now in modern Oxford for the furtherance of the kingdom of heaven in the same sort of way, we hope, that Newman and his friends did here at Littlemore and later on in Birmingham. But where they did spend their money, of course, was in the chapel. And again, the chapel has been reconstructed, but they had it hung with red damask like this, and a little altar or table with the white curtain covering the window. Of course, in those days, there would have been no question of reserving the Blessed Sacrament. They were still members of the Church of England, and it was quite inconceivable in the 1840s for the Church of England to reserve the sacrament in any form. And I don't imagine they would have felt courageous enough to have a crucifix with a figure on it, or even less so, a statue of Our Blessed Lady. These are all things that have been put here more recently. The chapel would have been fairly stark to our tastes, but hung with this rich red damask as a way of showing that this is the most important room in the house. Other people live in simplicity. Newman himself lived in very stark simplicity, but the chapel is to be a place of richness, because it is in this chapel that we meet God. And it was in this chapel, in the fullness of time, that Newman was received into the Catholic Church by Blessed Dominic Barbary. They brought in his writing desk to use as an altar. We'll see the desk itself in a few moments in the library. And Blessed Dominic had to go down to the Catholic chapel in Oxford to borrow the candlesticks and the chalice and the vestments and everything else. They had nothing here suitable for saying Mass with. So with borrowed equipment on an old writing desk, the first Mass was said in this chapel, and John Henry Newman and some of his companions were received into the one fold of the Redeemer. Now it's a chapel in daily use. The Sisters of the Work meet here for prayer on many occasions during the day, long periods of prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, and as often as possible, Mass is celebrated here. We come here usually on a Monday morning to celebrate an early Mass for them. And it is a place of great grace where many, many other people have come to to be received into the church, to find peace and surety, certainty, with the truth that John Henry Newman preached in this chapel and in this place. Newman came here from Oxford for a short time. Perhaps even at the very beginning of that time, he realized it would be only a short time. It was a staging post. It led him on. He continued to follow the kindly light from Oxford to Littlemore, and then from Littlemore on to the Oratory.
Soon after his reception into the Catholic Church, Newman began his preparation for the priesthood in Rome. He also moved his band of followers from Littlemore to Maryvale near Birmingham. Finally, at age 78, Newman was made a cardinal by the Pope Leo XIII, recently elected himself. After many years of rejections by his former friends, and at times difficult inclusion in the Catholic Church, this Church of the First Disciples was giving him a deserved place. Even the University of Oxford, who had rejected him, was touched and let him preach again in the chapel. John Henry Newman had been chosen a descendant of the first disciples of Christ he loved so much. He was now to be known as Cardinal Newman.